Excellent. Good morning. Welcome to NYC 2025 Continuing Conversations. I'm Martha Stark. I'm a clinical professor of practice here at NYU Wagner, and I'm really pleased this morning to be joined by Liz Glazer and Eric Rosenbaum. Elizabeth Glazer goes by Liz, but I actually love saying her first name in part because that's my middle name. And I actually use my middle initial. So I'm really, really great. Let me say a word or two about NYC 2025, this project. And then what I'll do is introduce our two guests. They will each take about 10 to 12 minutes to present their incredible papers on topics that are certainly near and dear to the city's heart right now, always, but especially kind of right in this moment. So I will introduce them. We're going to start off with Eric and then go to Liz. I'll have a few questions for them and then leave enough time actually for you all to ask questions as well. So first, let me say a word or two about NYC 2025. This was an idea that was born out of NYU's interest as a institution in the city in being able to come up with policy ideas for the new administration so that we can become stronger and more equitable than we were before COVID. That was kind of our idea about it. So a bunch of people in actually December of 2020 said, how do we do this? And so at NYU Wagner, we were only pleased to have an opportunity to contribute our kind of expertise and to pull together, again, some non-partisan experts across a range of areas. So the first iteration of this conversation, we were trying to figure out how New York City could increase the flexibility with which in which it responds to change. How do we prioritize inclusivity and equality in the city's economic growth? How do we restore and boost how the city improves its quality of life for all New Yorkers? And then finally, finding the most efficient uses possible for the city budget. We've now compiled 30 different papers and reports, and they have been really well received. And this is probably the 8th continuing conversation so far that we've had. So let me just say a word or two about our two speakers here. So Eric Rosenbaum, what I will say about him is that he is probably one of the most modest people you're going to meet for the incredible task and work that he is actually sort of doing. He is the president and CEO of Project Renewal. And if you're looking at my screen right now, I did put up a little picture of our team, because unlike sort of many organizations, when you go to their website and you want to read about the person, you can click on their name and it gives you sort of this full-fledged bio. But instead, actually consistent with how it seems Eric leads Project Renewal and thinks about issues, it's a team thing for him. So he's been a visionary, complex, I should say Project Renewal is a visionary and complex homeless services agency, has a substantial real estate portfolio. He himself has really incredibly diverse experience, nonprofit board experience, but also leading organizations. Before actually Project Renewal, he was the chief executive officer at Lantern Community Services and also the chief operating officer at WIN Inc., which is actually where, and we have some other people who we know who are now leading that organization. Eric is creative, he's fun, and what I will say about him as a person who also really cares about Ruth Messenger, who was the Manhattan Borough president, she speaks so incredibly highly about Eric all the time. And if Ruth says you're great, you're even greater than great, because she does not dole out that word so easily. And so Eric, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. The next person, let me just stop my share. Or actually, I think it'll work if I just click on this. Let me just see. Did that switch us to Vital City? So I just think the world of Liz Glazer. My sister actually is a court officer. And so she also knows of Liz and Liz's work with the criminal justice system. There's not there's not enough that I can talk about Liz. She was a visiting urbanist here at NYU Wagner. Dean Gleed actually calls her Lizzie because she knows her going back quite a while for the work that she's done. But I do want to make a plug right now for a new project that she's embarked on called Vital City. Liz is one of the sort of best thinkers about criminal justice policy and the like. And she is held in such high esteem by people from my sister, who's a court officer, to folks through and through the system because of her thoughtful, data-driven look at criminal justice issues and her actual belief that there are things that we can do both in a way that is fair and just for the criminal justice system. So I'll kind of leave it a little bit at that, but there's so much more that I'll kind of, web in, I'm sort of weave in when we're talking in conversation. So with that, what I'll do again is turn it over to Eric. And Eric, you have 10, there are only 2 panelists with this one. So 10 to 12 minutes, just telling us a bit about your paper and about Project Renewal's work. And again, thank you both for being here.
Great, and thank you so much for having me and for inviting Project Renewal to submit this paper. I want to start by giving a little bit of background on why we wrote it. Most people may not know that that in the first summer of the pandemic, when New York City was moving people en masse, 10,000 people out of congregate shelters and into hotels, Project Renewal was the organization that was hosting 283 homeless men at the Lucerne Hotel on the Upper West Side, which became an incredible flashpoint in the community over the use of hotels and over how we treat homeless individuals. And the conversation, which was exhausting and consuming, was also kind of ridiculous because we weren't talking about the real issues that drive homelessness and the real things we could do to make it better. So we decided that we would write this paper to try and frame both some of the root causes and the history of how we got here today, and also solutions that we thought would be feasible economically, feasible politically, and feasible logistically. So first of all, let me say that the homeless crisis is really a housing crisis. At its core, we don't have enough housing that's matched to the incomes of New Yorkers. But there are also separate streams that feed this. So we have had a significant reduction in the number of beds in psychiatric hospitals. So people who are now in shelter often have far greater mental illness challenges than they used to. We're also reducing the population of people who are incarcerated, but we don't have housing for them. 50% of the people who leave prisons are bused directly to a shelter intake center. So while we thought that we were doing great things by reducing these other 2 parts of our system, we didn't create the housing that met the needs that those people had. And so shelter in the streets becomes kind of the place of last resort, where when all other systems fail, people end up. And so many of the problems that we're talking about today, like people who are significantly mentally ill and maybe exhibiting tendencies towards aggression on the subways or the streets, it's one segment of this larger challenge. But if we really want to address homelessness, we have to address housing. And one of the core recommendations in our paper was that we can't just put more money, more capital into housing without looking at the speed with which we create it. That if we put money into capital today, it's a minimum of 5 years before that capital will result in individuals being in housing. And we don't have 5 years to wait. So our first recommendation was that we had to find ways to add to our housing supply above and beyond what the current pipeline could deliver, because the population of single adults in shelter before the pandemic was rising by 1,000 individuals each and every year with the pipeline of new housing that was being created. So we have to get to the point where we're reducing the pressure on the shelter system so that we can make the shelter system better. And the big idea is hotels. Before the pandemic, 20% of the hotel capacity in New York was considered excess. That was before the pandemic. During the pandemic, many hotels were in default on their financing and at risk of foreclosure. So the idea was to create a managed transition from these hotels to housing. And what makes it exciting is, one, the process of conversion physically is pretty easy. Every hotel room has its own bathroom. So adding a small kitchenette can create a small studio apartment without requiring brand new plumbing systems, changing elevators, all of those other things that a major gut renovation would require. So we could acquire properties quickly, renovate them quickly, and within a year to 18 months, have people with rent stabilized leases in these apartments. And this would be one of the most significant ways to accelerate the production of housing capacity that is linked to the population that needs the housing, single individuals. And many of these hotels also have capacity for program space, for offices, for meeting rooms, for community events, to provide supportive services. One of the things that people are excited about are housing vouchers. And I just want to say that while housing vouchers can help in the immediate term, housing vouchers themselves don't create capacity. They have to be converted into new capacity if it's really going to address the crisis. And what's another thing that's exciting here is that these vouchers can be used as collateral to acquire financing to convert these hotels. So it actually doesn't require massive infusions of new capital. We can create this capacity by essentially using the vouchers to fund the debt service that would allow nonprofits to acquire these. And the housing will not only be livable faster, but it's also cheaper than the cost of new construction. So it's a win all around. Sadly, the city hasn't been able to mobilize yet. So there's going to require some new legislation or some new workarounds that would make it possible. But I'm really still hopeful that we can convert thousands of units fairly quickly in the next couple of years. Once we generate this housing and take some of the pressure off the existing shelter system, we can start to restructure the shelter system itself. People wonder why there are so many people living on the streets who refuse shelter. It doesn't seem intuitive that the streets could be safer than shelter. The streets aren't safer than shelter, but that doesn't mean that that's the perception of the people who are on the streets. And shelters, particularly the older shelters, many of which are in city-owned buildings that were never designed for shelter, are very large, have big dormitories where people are sleeping 3 feet apart from each other. They're not always the safest environment. They don't give individuals control over their physical environment. There's very little privacy. And particularly for people with mental illness, this exacerbates the problem. But we need every bed we can have. So the city is unable to take offline some of this older shelter capacity and restructure it until we have more housing options for people. But once we do that, the city should be looking at the I think over 30 or 34 city-owned buildings today that are being used for shelter, and either repurpose them for better use or allow the nonprofits that are providing shelter in them to acquire them and redevelop them. And the reason why this is so important is that the city doesn't have capital to invest in these buildings to fix the building systems issues. But if they convey them to nonprofits, the nonprofits can secure debt financing backed by the city contract that would allow for the renovation or the bringing of these facilities up to code. And that would start to make the shelter system more hospitable and make it possible to provide more of the services that people really need. As we restructure the shelter system, and also most city shelters are actually leased from private landlords. And the leases are expensive, in part because the risk of being a landlord in a shelter has been pretty high. So over time, converting these leased properties once again to nonprofit ownership consolidates accountability in the organization that's providing the services. It's more economically feasible and controllable by the city, and allows for better provision of services. And once we start to do this, we can also make shelters smaller, because big shelters are harder to manage, harder to provide the human connection that you need with the people you're serving, and focus more of the services on making people housing ready. Today, not only did we have the census of shelter going up by 1,000 people a year, but length of stay in shelter was increasing to the point where it's like an average of 1.5 years. And most of that time isn't spent doing anything other than waiting for housing. So if we can relieve the pressure on the housing front, we can make sure that while people are in shelter, they're getting the mental health services, the medical services, the substance use treatment services, the occupational therapy services that they need, so that when they do get a lease and move into an apartment, whether it's independent or supported housing, they're really ready to be functional in it. And all of this, if we do this, can actually save the city money, because housing is actually less expensive than shelter, particularly when you look at all of the added services that are required just to keep people functioning in shelter. So I think I'll stop here and look forward to the next part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Really, really great presentation, and really your ability to make the issue so kind of accessible to us and clear, just really, really thoughtful and appreciated. Let me turn it over to Liz Glazer. Liz, you're muted.
Yeah, year 3, and you would think I would know how to unmute myself, so apologies. Just wanted to say, Eric, incredible presentation. And for me, it's a recurring theme for my area as well, about how enormous the power of government and its resources are to solve these problems, and how critical it is to have effective operations. It comes down to sometimes just the most anodyne issue, which is, can you mobilize and organize and focus? So I think everyone seems to be worried about crime these days, and there's a reason to be worried about crime. Shootings in New York City doubled in the first year of the pandemic, and they've stayed there. And just, one caveat there, that is a terrible, terrible thing and something that we need to address. I'll note that it was also something that was experienced by every big city in the country, and that we're not where we were in the 1990s when murders reached their peak. We're about where we were in Mayor Bloomberg's administration. Just to sort of give us a little context, but still to say there is great urgency when something like that happens. And so there's rightly enormous concern. And it's also accompanied by a sense that the city potentially is increasingly on the skids, at a time when the pandemic has really sort of turned everyone's life upside down. I think there's a sense that, and Eric, I think you confirmed that it's probably the reality, that we're seeing more and more people living on the street. There's more evidence of open air, drug markets, and other things that make New Yorkers uneasy and is evidence of enormous distress. And this year so far, unfortunately, crime, which had been limited to shootings, that's really where the focus was in the rise. This year in New York City, we're now starting to see all areas of crime rising. And we care about crime for all the obvious reasons, but relevant to this panel, we care about it because it shutters civic life. When there is violence and high crime, businesses don't open, kids don't play in parks, it reverberates in ways that are not immediately visible. Gun violence retards achievement in school, among many, many other, bad effects. And so the question is, what do we do about this? And our impulse, which is very much on display now in the city, and has really been honed by decades of practice, is when there is crime, we call the police. And that's really sort of the major response. And we see that with our mayor now, very vigorously all around the city, appearing at crime scenes, deploying police. We saw it when President Biden came to the city, that he went to police headquarters surrounded by, a sea of blue, vowing to deploy federal prosecutors and federal resources. But there have been real harms to this approach, which has been the default really since the 1980s. And the harms have been harms that have been borne almost entirely by communities of color. And I wanted to just take a quick detour to detail what those are, because I think when you think about what the harms are versus what safety police can deliver, it makes sharp why we must ask the question, police compared to what? Or police in addition to what? And so for those who don't know, this is sort of the penny tour. You probably do know that crime rose dramatically through the 80s and 90s through the whole of the United States, particularly in New York City. Just to give you an idea, in the early 1990s, murders were well north of 2,000 a year. Even in this past year, they've been at about 400 or 450. And there was an enormous ratchet up in the deployment of criminal justice power, particularly incarceration. People probably have heard that, the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 20% of its prisoners. In New York City at its height, we incarcerated about 22,000 people in our jails, compared to about 5,000 now. And the effect of all of that was that, among many, many other things, it really benched an entire generation of people, particularly Black men of color. about a third of Black men in New York City's poorest neighborhoods will see the inside of a cell by the time that they're 36. And you can imagine how that hollows out the life of a neighborhood. And in fact, violence and the operation of the criminal justice system has been concentrated in New York City in really just a handful of neighborhoods. The same neighborhoods that led the city in shootings in the 1990s, while those shootings are much diminished now, are virtually the same neighborhoods that lead the city in shootings now. They are almost entirely home to Black and brown New Yorkers. And just to sort of drive home what that means in a city, which, by the way, is still the safest large city in the nation. If you're a young Black man, your chances of being shot are 88 times that of a young white man. So it indicates how incredibly concentrated violence is. And it's not just violence, every manner of distress for a whole set of social reasons are concentrated in these neighborhoods, from high asthma to high unemployment to dilapidated building stock. And it's led to this enormous cynicism and estrangement from the criminal justice system and from government in general, reflected perhaps most in the fact that the ability to solve cases, i.e. rely upon New Yorkers to come forward and report crimes and be witnesses, is incredibly low, particularly low in these neighborhoods where during the pandemic, the solve rate of shootings sank to something in the low 20% range. And it's unbelievably expensive to secure our safety, really primarily through the criminal justice system. And the one often cited number, but it's striking, is the fact that we spend well more than $500,000 a year to incarcerate a person in Rikers Island, the city jail system, which is just a stunning amount. And Eric could tell us how much housing we could buy for that. But and the one last thing I would say before sort of raising sort of what some solutions to this could be is that more than, or in addition to these harms, there's sort of another thing that has happened, which is it's not just that we default to the police when we are concerned about crime. It's also that police have become almost their own civic service, meaning they're in neighborhoods 24/7. They are on the front lines seeing every social ill, really unfair both to them and to New Yorkers that they are called upon to solve every social ill. They're easily deployed. And today they really have seeped into every civic service. They run community centers, graffiti cleanup, mentorships, part of homeless outreach, mental health outreach, and not just at the table, they run the table. And so the question is there another way within our grasp of deploying all civic services, of which police are an important civic service, to not just reduce crime, but to actually build prosperity? And we have enormous and very solid evidence in our own city and across the nation of what a different approach might look like that weaves together every possible civic service in order to create safety. And so I'll describe just a couple of these things that we know very concretely and that we know with the best evidence that we could possibly have through random controlled trials I did that for you, Martha. So here are a few of the things. We know from a random controlled trial done in our housing developments in the last few years that when you turn on the lights, when you light public places at night, serious crime goes down by 36%. And that is not just a one-time thing, that is a sustained effect. We know from evidence in our own city about summer youth employment that when kids have summer youth employment, it's not just that violent crime arrests go down significantly, but mortality, the chance of them dying, reduces as well. These are just two of scores of different kinds of things that we already do, but we sort of do in a scattershot way without focusing on a strategy to actually achieve a particular result as far as reducing crime. And we also have structures in place to deploy many of these kinds of efforts that are not necessarily police first, but are really civic engagement first. So for example, in New York City, we have one of the most robust networks and systems of something called a crisis management system. These are violence interrupters, that is, people who have had contact with the criminal justice system, know their neighborhoods well, can have enough connections to understand when disputes are escalating potentially to violence, and have the credibility to step in and stop them before they become violent. This is a well-organized effort that in research in our city has shown 30% reductions in shootings in these neighborhoods versus neighborhoods that don't have it. We have what are called neighborhood stats in 15 of the housing developments that bring together city agencies, CBOs, residents, in order to both identify what problems are and to solve them. Everything from garbage to broken doors, which are adjacent to, but not crime itself. But what we don't do is that we're not organized, we don't coordinate, we don't hold our feet to the fire, we don't ask whether we're getting the most safety for every dollar we spend, and we don't ask, compared to what are we doing a criminal justice intervention versus a weaving together of civic services. The reason why I find this so challenging is that it is within our grasp. It is within our grasp to have a system that builds people's lives, supports communities, increases prosperity without so many of the harms that the criminal justice system has seen to us, that we've seen from the criminal justice system. And it may be that I have an old-fashioned belief that government can be a force for good. I do. It exists by, with, and for the people. We spend $100 billion a year in the city of New York for the safety and well-being of our people. It is a recurring budget and network that no one else has, not philanthropy, not nonprofits, not anyone. But it needs to be deployed and it needs to be organized. And so my prime recommendation, which is something that Mayor Adams has done, is that we have a deputy mayor for justice who can coordinate the many and independent parts of the justice system, for sure, orienting them towards a common goal, but can also work with his fellow deputy mayors to synthesize the kinds of civic goods that are also necessary to set the benchmarks and goals and to ensure that we meet those benchmarks and goals. So that's my prime recommendation. There are a lot of details as well, but look forward to our conversation.
Liz, thank you so much. This is, for me now, the second time I've heard you talk about your paper, and each time there's just sort of more and more there, and it's just, both of your papers so well done, so thoughtful, so practical. I want to pick up, if you don't mind, on a theme that I think you both kind of hit upon, that this is all within our grasp. I mean, that's what Eric said. That's what you so eloquently said just now. And you told us kind of one piece, Liz, the Deputy Mayor for Justice has the potential to actually implement some of what you certainly have recommended in your paper. I wondered, Eric, if you don't mind, could you talk a little bit about kind of operationalizing, implementing what needs to happen from your perspective at City Hall with the City Council for your ideas to actually become a reality, or to actually, where we grasp it, we really have it?
So thanks. The first thing I would say is that housing and homelessness are two parts of the city administration. And they need to be completely and totally linked. So appointing a chief housing officer in Jessica Katz is a great move. But operationally, we have to make sure that the process of linking people to housing and creating housing is just as accountable as the process of sheltering people. And one simple metric I would focus on is that the last several administrations have used a metric, which is the number of affordable units created and preserved. However, there's a big part missing, which is the number that are lost. And so the metric should be the net change in affordable units, including the ones we're losing, and be accountable for addition and not subtraction on a net basis, because in the last 30 years, we've basically broken even. We have only created as many new units as we have lost. Actually, I think I have to go back and check the math. I think we're still negative, but we're finally at a place where each year we're balancing what we're losing. So we should set those kind of goals. Second of all, we have to create a fast lane for affordable housing development. The number of bureaucratic steps that it takes to get approval for a project, to get Con Ed to come out and improve the elevator, months. The financing, putting together the financing package, months. If there was kind of a project management office that took a look at every single project that was in development and was available to break through barriers when a project gets stuck, the speed with which we could get units in place could be accelerated, and it would have to be saving so much money compared to the cost of delay. So I think there's a lot operationally. There's also some legal issues. Right now, you can't convert hotels that don't have a residential certificate of occupancy into residential use. That was a decision the last administration made, which contradicted 30 years of practice. There are 4 hotels, and we operate one of them, that since the 1990s had been fully leased up residential buildings, still having a hotel certificate of occupancy. And I think there are over 70 hotels in the city which operate as hotels, but actually have rent stabilized tenants in them dating back to the old SRO days. So we know that there's plenty of precedent for hotels being housing, and we need to remove the roadblocks to doing that. We also need to look at land use. A lot of hotels are not in residential zones, but they're close, or the neighborhood has changed to the point where it would really be viable for this to be housing. And So legislation that would allow that to be accelerated would make a huge difference. And I don't mean to underestimate what the legal and regulatory issues are, but every time we let them get in the way, we expand our shelter system, we have more people on the streets, and so we're not balancing the cost versus the benefit. We're only looking at the cost side. It takes a different frame of reference, but I think that's what's needed now. And I actually am encouraged because I'm seeing different parts of the new administration work in ways that wasn't happening previously. So I'm excited that there's a spirit and a willingness, I think right now, to do that.
That's great, Eric. Liz, did you want to add anything? I mean, you talked about the Deputy Mayor for Justice. Anything else that you think what would really make this really not just within our grasp, but something that can happen?
Yeah, I mean, I was very struck by Eric's account because I think that almost in every place you could replace housing with crime, and this notion of the difficulty of operationalizing things within the city is just enormous, and that requires will to do it. But it also requires something else. I think that there's a way to bolster will, which is to have visible, public, understandable goals, and to commit yourself to a radical transparency, whether it's good or bad, for how the city's doing, as to how you're doing on getting there. That's something that, at least in the crime and criminal justice context, partly because it's such a complicated system, but partly because so much data is not available or not understandable or not sort of translated, that we really don't have. So, for example, the mayor recently announced that he's going to restart a group that was called Anti-Crime, whose job it is to be on the street and to try and get guns off the street. And it's been quite a controversial unit. He's redeployed them in a kind of revamped way about a week ago. I think it would be an important thing, and he said this is just one layer of many things that we're doing. It would be an important thing for New Yorkers to understand, how are they doing? And not only how are they doing, but to what degree and compared to what does doing this stop shootings versus, for example, maybe putting more investigative resources into solving the shootings, I think would be an important thing to ask. So I think visible goals, accessible to any New Yorker, and a real commitment to telling New Yorkers how it's going would be important.
And I think, that is what you're trying to do with your new organization is, right, to kind of create that kind of dashboard with visible goals and transparency. I'm certain that some of that is probably limited by maybe your access to data about what, the city kind of really has articulated as what they want to accomplish. But I do think that it's interesting to me what both of you are saying, whether or not, it's Eric, as you described, sort of talking about the number of affordable units, not just putting out the kind of positive, look at what we did, but kind of the net, so that people actually have a sense of, like, you are what you measure, right? If you don't actually say there's a problem here, it's going to be really hard to solve it. And I think so much of what we sometimes do in government is try to put out the good news story. And the good news story would be even better if we were as transparent as possible about what it is we're trying to accomplish. I think that's what you're both sort of saying. It's really, really interesting to sort of think about from a policy perspective and implementation perspective. Go ahead, Liz.
And I think there's another thing as well, which is I do think government is a little gun shy for sure about the bad story. And that often sort of drives actually policy. I think that and people are cynical about government, and that's a real problem in making government work. And I think that that people appreciate it when officials are straight with them, whether it's good or bad, and that the ability to be able to show what it is you're working on and what the obstacles are and how to get there would actually build trust and make it understandable what the challenges are, and make it easier to overcome the bad story and to get to a better place. And, I think it was interesting. I think in a small way, I think the police department has been doing a little bit of this. People may remember this terrible shooting a month or two ago at a Burger King of a 17-year-old girl who was working there. And they solved the shooting. And at the press conference announcing that they had found the person who had pulled the trigger, they went through in great detail what it is the detectives had to do, how it was that the public information helped in order to finally identify who the person was. And it wasn't grandstanding, it wasn't patting on the back, it was really just being straight with people. And it was incredibly compelling about what great work this was, how much dedication it took, and how complicated it was to get to that ending. So, that's just one example.
Yeah, it does sound like there's real reason for some optimism, right? If that kind of becomes the framework for doing some stuff. So given kind of how complicated all of this sort of is, I'm just wondering, about yesterday we had a session, that where Linda Gibbs presented stuff on anchor institutions. And so the sort of folks who are actually in neighborhoods kind of and the like. So I just kind of had this question about, the press. So, I get, summaries of all kinds of press stories. And, recently the Empire Report has made a big deal of always telling us about the number of shootings that have occurred over the weekend and kind of where those shootings were. Any sort of possibility of, there being some tragedy that might have occurred because of, maybe a homeless person with some mental health, challenges. The press seems to me to be such an important partner in getting out the story, but the story in not a way that makes us all afraid, but that actually helps us understand both the complexity of the issue, but what's being done. Just wondered, Eric, Liz, what thoughts do you have about that? And how do you, Eric, Project Renewal, if possible, work with the press? Liz, I know you have relationships with the press, kind of what vital role they can play in making sure these policies also get done.
So we obviously work with the press all the time, but we're also not relying on the press to tell the story. If you really want to address homelessness, you do have to have a base of solid knowledge about the root causes, about the trends, about the various systems. You can't have a good conversation if you're not grounded in that. So we're working with corporations, for instance. A lot of millennial employees want their employers to be civically engaged. But the corporate leaders think of homelessness as maybe being a philanthropic issue for their foundation and not a strategic issue for the success of the company in New York City. But housing affordability and people feeling safe on the streets are core issues to their thousands of employees. So we are actually working directly with corporations that give us access and the ability to engage their workforce. So the workforce feels empowered to understand the issue a little bit better, to maybe go to a community board meeting. And, and community board meetings are now on Zoom. You can do it from your living room. If you want to get engaged, go to your community board. Find out what's happening in your neighborhood. Learn a little bit. There's this incredible disengagement between kind of the corporate workforce and everyday civic life. And reconnecting that is something that we can do. It's actually something we have to do because we put facilities into neighborhoods. And usually the first response is, oh my God, more homeless people in our neighborhood, this is going to destroy us. Well, we have to go out and meet with people in the neighborhood. We've got to get them to understand what we're doing, who the people are that we're serving, what their challenges are, why it is safe, why it doesn't hurt property values. The press can be an ally and a participant in that, but the press's goals aren't always the same as our goals. They're interested in readers. They're interested in stories. Stories sometimes have to be sensational in order to get people's attention. The work we're talking about is more on the ground, but I think it's also more sustainable.
Yeah, Liz, did you want to add anything to that? That's really well said, Eric. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, really not much. Just to say, I do think the press is just extraordinarily important, both in identifying problems that might otherwise not come to light. Investigative reporters are so important, and also in getting information out. And there is, hopefully sort of being a check upon how politicized, at least in the criminal justice area, some information has become. One hopes that they will be a check, and I think they can be a very useful check.
So if there's any questions from the folks who are actually listening in right now, remember these sessions are being recorded. And so if you like what you hear, please make sure once the recordings are available, you're passing them on to folks. I just wonder, what can a place like NYU Wagner, in addition to, of course, highlighting your papers, what can we do? Like, how can we, I was really struck, both of your papers, but Eric, you laid out, for example, I think this is about kind of leadership from the mayor, but also there needs to be these task forces. And you had the task forces, it was really well done with specific things that you thought those task forces should do. Should NYU bring in a group of capstone students to kind of maybe present to the task force? We looked at this issue. Here's how we should think about what can we do? Because I think we at Wagner, we're committed to public service. We're committed to New York City and other places. And I just wonder, as you all think about the thorny things, how can an academic institution like us play a role in helping?
I'll say something, this may come from left field, but I think land use is critical. Land use is the place where private property rights come in to meet public goals. And we're not going to solve our housing crisis without making some changes in how we make decisions about land use. It's a complicated and arcane field, but I think simplifying it, helping people understand the last 5 decades of land use policy and how those decisions were made. In the immediate post-war period, land use decisions were explicitly racially discriminatory. It was in the law, you could do that. Now people say today, well, those policies aren't discriminatory today, but the land use decisions that had been made in the subsequent years didn't change the way land got divided then. So even though the policies today aren't discriminatory, the impact still is, because we haven't reversed or remediated, might be a better term, the impact of some of those historical decisions on displacing communities and displacing them over and over and over again in the process of urban renewal, et cetera. Helping people understand how land use today could remedy that is, I think, a great academic project.
That's fantastic. It's interesting because yesterday's panel also came down to like, so much of this is on the land use side. And that was an interesting panel. It was, you know, what's the power of the mayor, you know, taxes, and then also this idea of anchor institutions. And what was interesting about it, and why I think what you're saying, Eric, is so compelling, is because land use is one of the areas that is exclusively in the domain of the city officials. Unlike, you know, lots of other things, education, you need to state, or lots of criminal justice policies, you need to state, but land use you can actually do. So that really makes it something worth focusing on. So Liz, did you have anything that you would kind of add? What can NYU Wagner, what can institutions and academic places do?
I think one of the greatest skills that a place like Wagner could bring to bear, and so needed, is to help on hot wiring data together and making it accessible and available and understandable to every New Yorker.
That's great. And that's certainly something that we'd like our continued project here to sort of do. And part of the reason why we call this NYC 2025, so we wanted to sort of start something now and then see kind of and keep track of and follow up on what's getting done, what's not getting done, but with some real data and transparency. And so what I was going to say is that I do hope that we can draw on some of what you've already said. You know, you talk both about project management skills, you know, about coordinating sort of skills and stuff like that. And certainly we teach that in many of our courses here, but I think that, you know, we'd love to kind of put in place a system that, as you said, kind of culls, wires together data that really allows us to tell the story of what's being accomplished and what can still be accomplished. So I appreciate those recommendations. Eric, it seems like you had another thought, you know, as you were thinking there as we wrap up, actually.
No, I think I'm good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of close out this panel. I mean, I don't need to say, I mean, Liz and Eric, your papers, we really, really appreciate your thoughts, your thoughtfulness, your commitment to the city with the work that you do. I don't know how anyone could really do it without you. I do hope that, you know, we can get to a place where we are able to grasp this. It's so incredibly important. And there are ideas out there that are implementable and that would make a huge, huge difference to, you know, the people who aren't in shelters, not sheltered, to, you know, the people living and working in and around New York City. These issues are so vital to our kind of recovery. And I thank you for your contribution, and especially thank you for your time today. Ruth Messenger sent us a note. She was actually participating with us. We greatly appreciate her, and also just want to take a moment to sort of thank NYU Wagner and our advisory board, who have been just incredible, and also the funders of this project. And so with that, I'll close that out and hope you have a really, really great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Bye.
Thank you.